Hey, today's Bible reading devotion is found in John chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. Here, the Apostle John is telling us of Jesus's conversation with Nicodemus. Nicodemus, one of the Sanhedrin, one of the religious leaders, one of the top religious leaders, is having this conversation with Jesus, and Jesus is just describing him about the whole importance of being born again. And he ultimately gets to verse 16. Yes, verse 16, the universal verse that everyone can reference to, or at least they've heard John 3:16. For God so loved who? The world. And I think that's so important. I think sometimes we forget that as believers. Sometimes we say, well, God so loved us, but maybe not them. Make it clear here. It says, for God so loved the world, that everyone has a chance at salvation because Jesus gave of himself. Jesus gave so that anyone can find life in him. But Jesus' words don't stop with verse 16. Instead, it continues with verse 17. It says that God didn't send Jesus to come judge the world, but yet that they could find salvation. Now, I will say this, Jesus is going to come back, and at that point, he is going to judge the world. But when he came first, he came that salvation can be known through his sacrifice, through his sacrificial death. Everyone can find salvation. And he is saying to Nicodemus, listen, I've come so that everyone can find life. But yet, verse 18 follows, and it says, for he who believes in him is not judged, meaning that there is a safety in who Jesus is, and that safety is Jesus' grace and his mercy when we believe and accept in who he is. But for those who do not believe, they have already judged. And that they have just said, forget who Jesus is. Jesus truly wasn't the Son of God. Jesus truly didn't sacrifice himself for our sins, and that complete rejection automatically leads them to judgment. John is specifically not speaking about this little bit of belief or whatever, but this whole attitude of recognizing who Jesus is once and for all and settling it for yourself. And as Jesus has this conversation with Nicodemus, he is telling Nicodemus the importance of who he is. He is telling Nicodemus that he is the Son of God and that he is going to go ultimately to the cross. Yes, those words aren't used specifically, but that's what Jesus is inferring as he has this conversation with Nicodemus. As he lays out the importance of believing in Jesus and believing in what Jesus came to do. And that Jesus came to die for sin. Die for salvation. And as he talks with Nicodemus, Nicodemus starts to get it. And yes, the Bible doesn't necessarily say Nicodemus fully got it, but it kind of infers it when we see Nicodemus just sticking up for who Jesus is time and time again. I want to challenge you today and just remind you today of the love that Christ has for you. The love that Christ has for a lost and dying world. That he came as the penalty to take on our sin, to be sacrificed for the penalty of our sin. He came so that we can find hope in him. And we who truly believe don't have to worry about judgment. Don't have to worry about anything except for following God. But we need to be a voice for those who haven't heard, for those who don't believe, as we continually talk about what Jesus has done for them, in hopes that they can find and know who Jesus is, so that they can experience being born again. May we live in the love of Christ today.